Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The police said today that there was nothing to suggest that the fire, which broke out in the early hours of Wednesday morning, was started deliberately. Investigators are still trying to piece together what happened and how the blaze spread so quickly throughout the building. There are now 3 inquiries by the police, by the fire brigade and the full public inquiry. Our Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons now on the questions the inquiry will have to consider.
My mate told me about 20 minutes ago, Grenfell Tower was on fire, and I was like, man.
It's the first obvious question. It's for the fire brigade to answer. This video was shot 20 minutes or so after the fire started. Where?
It started from flat 16.
How?
I see a geezer come running out of flat 16 saying he's on the phone. Wait, he's on the phone calling for a fire brigade, saying that it was a fridge fire. I said, well, what's called fire? He's saying a fridge fire.
The guy's fridge was by his window, by his kitchen window. So when the fire brigade had put the fire out, the fire had already gone through the window and all the cladding on the outside, and the wind has helped it, and then all of a sudden cladding is just all caught.
He said the cladding caught, and that leads to question number 2. It shouldn't have. The building was reclad with aluminium panels in 2016. The work was signed off by the council. So far, there's no evidence standards were breached, but
the regulations are the minimum safety standard that's expected for a building to keep it, reasonably safe for the occupants and people around it. If you're using materials or you're using it in a circumstances that you know are more dangerous, then you have to mitigate that. Make a risk assessment and engineer out that risk.
in this test, the fire's contained by flame-proof walls. Experts say good fire safety results from good design. Was the redesign to Grenfell Tower safe? And were there other factors? After the work was completed, gas pipes were moved to public areas in the tower. Residents were furious. The job of finding out who might be to blame has now been taken over by the police.
What we will do from the investigation is we will get to the answer of what has happened and why. That is why the police have taken the lead for the investigation. And if criminal offences have been committed, it is us who will investigate that.
Examining the wreckage will just be the start. They'll have to look at the role of the council, building managers, contractors, subcontractors. A vast job. The question of whether tower blocks are safe will be for the public inquiry. But for now, across the country, this is Luton, councils are checking fire safety procedures and refurbishment work. Deaths in fire are rare. Just 229 people were killed at home last year. Another question for the public inquiry, because there have been plenty of warnings in the past. Cladding was a factor in this fire in Southwark in 2009. A coroner suggested more sprinkler systems might be considered, but introducing them widely might mean a new approach to fire safety, something for the inquiry to consider. The 70s-era Grenfell Tower was designed simply to contain the spread of flames, what's called passive fire safety. But all of these modern developments will have fire detection systems and sprinklers. Bringing those older blocks up to this sort of standard would not be cheap, and it would certainly be disruptive for their residents. But what price should we put on a life, especially on the lives of those living in towers, often the poorest in society? This disaster has triggered a national debate, which could last years. Tom Simons, BBC News.
Thank you. Well, now a public inquiry has been ordered into the Grenfell fire, looking at the materials used on the exterior of the building, as well as what fire safety measures were in place. Reviews of high-rise blocks around the UK are already underway. Channel 4 News understands that the government was warned about inflammable cladding used on buildings in an official report, but the same report suggested that current guidelines were adequate. Our senior Home Affairs correspondent Simon Israel reports.
High up in the ruins of Grenfell Tower, the search goes on, while the investigation is in its very early stages. The Metropolitan Police says it's looking at possible corporate manslaughter. But that's a long way off, given there are so many involved in the recent history of this tower block. The material used in the cladding was potentially inflammable plastic sandwiched between two sheets of aluminium. The UK manufacturer Omnis Exteriors, which made the material, said it was asked to supply the cheaper version, £2 per square metre cheaper. The slightly more expensive alternative was, the company says, more fire resistant.
Quite why anyone thinks it is okay to cover a building with flammable materials and basically create an inferno or the prospect of an inferno, I cannot understand. It beggars belief.
Channel 4 News has uncovered research commissioned by the Department of Communities and Local Government last year, which warned of the need, when installing exterior panels, to prevent the spread of fire. Yet the same report suggested the current guidelines were adequate. It said,
"There is currently no evidence from these investigations to suggest that the current recommendations to limit vertical fire spread up the exterior of high-rise buildings are failing in their purpose."
The Housing Minister who inherited this report was Gavin Barwell. A promised review never materialised.
Could the deaths at Grenfell have been avoided?
Today he refused to answer questions. The fires prompted a nationwide review of the UK's 4,000 tower blocks. Many councils in London have already begun inspections. In Greenwich, fire safety checks have been completed on 6 blocks with external cladding. In Oxford, the council's promising an enhanced level of fire safety where refurbishments are taking place, including fire retardant cladding and sprinkler systems. In Greater Manchester, landlords of all 460 high-rise apartment blocks have been summoned to meet fire chiefs in the next week. And every high-rise resident in Hull will, the council promises, receive a door-to-door visit for reassurance. The guidelines which allow this to happen are still in place. And the question is whether the government will wait for a public inquiry before there's any change.
It will be a while before we know for sure what caused the Grenfell Tower fire and what led it to consume the building with such devastating speed. But already, as you know, questions have been asked about the cladding applied during a recent refurbishment. Newsnight revealed on Wednesday that it contained plastic and was less fire resistant than others available. Our investigations man, Phil Kemp, has been looking at possible weaknesses in the building. Phil, just talk us through what you found.
Well, yesterday we heard from the Fire Protection Association about their concerns about some of the materials that are used in modern construction and the fire risk that they pose. And that's not just the cladding that we revealed on Wednesday night was used in the Grenfell Tower case, this polyethylene core that is less fire resistant than some other types available, but also the kind of plastic insulation, the foamy stuff that sits between the external wall of social housing and this cladding. And there's been a real push in recent years to make these kinds of apartment buildings more energy efficient all over the country. But in doing that, and with the best of intentions, it seems that we may have introduced a new fire risk. Now, interestingly, I spoke to the fire chief of Frankfurt this morning, Professor Reinhard Ries. Frankfurt, obviously a city with lots of high-rise buildings, and he told me that these kinds of combustible products simply could not be used in high-rise buildings in Germany. They haven't been used for years, that's been the case there. It's also the case in Germany that they don't use lots of products that we use here that have a particular fire retardant because of the toxic chemicals that it gives off when it's on fire that are potentially lethal to people. So very different standards, it seems, between what we do here and in Germany.
You've talked about the outside, the cladding, but this also might be something inside, internal to the buildings.
Yeah, I spoke to another expert this morning who was telling me that in a block like Grenfell Tower, all of the front doors of the flats in a building like that have to be fire-safe doors in their own right, and they also have to be self-closing. And the reason for that is that if a fire breaks out in a flat, that will contain the fire and stop it from spreading throughout the block. Now, we know that there's been an issue with some other blocks at the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation. That's the organisation that's responsible for Grenfell Tower as well. We know that there's been a problem with these doors in some of the other blocks that they're responsible for. Now, the reason this might be relevant in the Grenfell Tower case is that there was smoke in the stairwells. We've also heard this story of a neighbour saying that she's able to look straight into the flat where apparently a fridge exploded, and the expert that I spoke to said that suggested there might have been a problem with the self-closing door in that case. So what's emerging, I think, now is the possibility that there is a combination of different factors, both internally and externally, that might all be coming together in a kind of perfect storm to lead to this devastating fire.
Phil, thank you very much. Thank you. Well, I'm going to return to Grenfell now. A lot of anger that we've been seeing today has been from friends and relatives who want to know what's happened to their loved ones. The tower is now a burnt-out shell, the site of a criminal investigation, and toxic and structurally unsafe. So how do they even begin to make sense of what actually happened in there on Tuesday night, and how long will it be before forensic teams are able to provide answers as to who lost their lives inside? Lessons can be learnt from the aftermath of the 9/11 attack on the Twin Towers. And one of the key forensic pathologists of that catastrophe was Dr. Judy Melinek, who joined me earlier from San Francisco. I asked her what she had learnt then that could be shared with us now.
A thorough investigation is not something that can be done overnight. It takes weeks and even months, and sometimes up to and including years, in order to get to the bottom of what happened. So in the immediate aftermath, first and most importantly, the people who are responding and the supervisors in charge need to make sure that the structure is sufficiently safe and sound so that first responders who are going in there and those who are charged with the recovery of the remains are safe as well. Otherwise, we'll have more tragedies. And the next step would be to collect important information from the families of the deceased about their ways to identify them, either identifying marks and scars, jewelry, tattoos, and then also collect DNA.
And how difficult do you think it will be to collect DNA?
The most important thing is that we don't know at this particular point what the condition of the remains are. There could be a whole discrepancy between people who are intact but just suffered from smoke inhalation compared to people whose bodies are completely charred. In a situation such as this, you can have difficulty because, for example, in 9/11, we could get exemplars from the deceased. So we can get the toothbrush of the person who's missing, or we can get the underwear of the person who's missing and use that to compare them to the person. It's easier to compare self to self than to compare self to next of kin. And so in this particular situation, you've got people who are dead within their residences. All of their personal property basically went up in flames with them. And so it seems that most likely the analyses are going to have to be to next of kin relatives, and that's more difficult.
So am I right in thinking that in the Twin Towers, some 40% of bodies were never identified?
That is correct. The reason for that is because of the forces at play in that particular incident, where you had jet fuel, you had collapse of the buildings, and then you had fires that went on for months. We don't have exactly the same scenario here, so I'm hopeful that DNA analysis will be more fruitful in a case such as this.
This will be devastating news to many of the families, and they will want to know what happens if they don't get that identification.
In the United States, for 9/11 victims who were not identified based on their bodies, there was a legal process put into place, a judicial process, where the person was declared dead and a death certificate was created so that the families could then have closure, close out financial concerns, and move on, even though the body parts had not yet been identified. So there was a delay in that. And then if and when DNA analysis occurred at a later time, those data points were merged with the death certificate that was put together by judicial review. So at least a death certificate allows the family to move on, even when remains are taking longer to identify.
Dr. Melinek, you started by saying the key was communication. Do you think authorities have explained fully enough here just how lengthy and difficult a process this will be?
I think it is important that they set up a command center and that they have public relations staff who are on hand to be able to answer these questions. Typically what happens is we will set up a family center separate from the coroner's office so that the families can go and get resources as well. And in this particular situation, you have people who are in need of housing as well and charity work. So that can all be centralized, and then you can use that family center as a repository for also collecting information about the deceased, the people who are missing, and also exemplars for DNA analysis.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.